Hello, everybody. My name is Susan Welch, and I want to welcome you to the next segment in our malt and brewing series with Proximity Malt. I have been with Proximity Malt for 4 years now as part of the sales and marketing team. And every once in a while, we bring you these segments with some of our favorite people in the brewing industry. Today, our topic is going to be high gravity brewing with Tim Hawn. I've known Tim for, I think just about, 15 years, maybe, Tim, something like that. Tim Hawn has been in the brewing industry for 24 years. He began his career in 1997 with Pabst Brewing Company in Olympia, Washington. He was a microbiologist. And shortly after beginning his career, he moved into brewing, into the brewing side of the business, running the brew house and the ethanol production facilities there. And as time progressed, he joined Miller Brewing Company, worked in 3 different breweries. He joined the craft beer ranks, taking on brewmaster role at Dogfish Head in Delaware in 2011. And, Tim has had a really multifaceted role in leading all phases of operations, which is why we wanted to chat with him today about high gravity brewing. He led the installation of Dogfish Head's new brew house, cellar expansion, packaging hall. His team managed raw materials qualification. Tim served as brewing manager for FIFCO USA, and currently he's working as a brew design consultant. He's got a lot to say about malt and brewing in all aspects. We're super excited to have him with us today. And I'm going to ask both Greg Fleehart and Matt Musial to quickly introduce themselves before we jump into today's topic, which is high gravity brewing.
Yeah, well, my name's Greg Fleehart. I'm the Mid-Atlantic Regional Sales Manager for Proximity Malt. And before coming to the Proximity team, I was a craft brewer for about 12 years, both in Washington State and Virginia. Currently live in Virginia, and I've brewed a lot of different types of beer, mostly on small scale, from 7 to 20 barrel systems.
Thanks, Greg. Matt Musial here in my current role with Proximity Malt. They call me the maltster and director in charge of quality and safety, but really I'm just a guy who turned a beer drinking habit into a career about 25 years ago. And much the same as Tim's bio that you just went through, my brewing career started in 1997 with a company called Stroh's. Worked in 2 different breweries in the 90s, moved on to Anheuser-Busch in the 2000s, working in a couple of different breweries out on the East Coast and in St. Louis, moving into raw materials and finishing my career with Anheuser-Busch as the senior maltster in Idaho Falls, Idaho. And I think when we talk about high gravity brewing, we first need to define what that really is. And I always like to call it as is brewing, which versus high gravity brewing. As is or brewing to style or to gravity is using the coming out of the brew house with the kind of OG that you want, or original gravity, in the wort so that it ferments into the alcohol percentage you want in the package. And then with minimal water pickup along the way, you hit your target in the package, ABV, etc. As you go through. Now, as we talk about high gravity brewing, there's I think really 2 ways to kind of define it. And larger breweries that have the capability of having chilled and processed water systems in which you can carbonate and clean up water really kind of use the entire brewery to enhance high gravity brewing, meaning that they make a high gravity wort, they ferment it as high gravity, high alcohol, process it, maybe even filter it, and wait till the end just before packaging to add dilution water to bring that down to the type of alcohol percentage or other specifications that beer might be. Consequently, craft brewing has taken that into what I'll call brew house only high gravity brewing, and because they have access to hot liquor water, or what we might call sparge water, and the ability to make a high gravity brew in the kettle and then chase it with water on the way to fermentation and then ferment as is all the way through there. It brings up some interesting quality questions and how you do things a little bit differently to ensure that the the beer going to the consumer is exactly the way you want it. So those are two of the ways that I would define it. And I think there's probably pluses and minuses to each. And I'd ask Tim to maybe comment a little bit about how the experiences in the large breweries using that that all the way through high gravity brewing system might be different than what craft brewers might have access to, and the types of equipment and things that you may need if you wanted to do that all the way through the brewery versus just in the brew house.
Sure. And one of the things, Matt, just to respond to that is it's always been that interesting experience is high gravity. And I know you defined as is, but I do have to point this out from my historical experiences. There's some craft guys making 32 Plato Warts, and that's standard gravity. So, but all the rules really from a brew house perspective are going to be the same, whether you're doing, not diluting it down things, you want a 15, 16% ABV beer or that. But, you mentioned equipment. And one of the things high gravity brewing does for you, whether you're a large brewer or a craft brewer, or, used to use the words medium gravity because some owners and some people are very philosophical about standard, but that medium gravity, as I look at it, is so you can chase things with good water behind it and increase your efficiency through the brewery. So there's also that piece. But, the point of this discussion, if we think about light beers, a lot of them in some companies are diluted almost for every barrel of wort you make. You're going to add a barrel of water, right? Either before filtration or just post filtration with sterile water that's deaerated, and you're getting double your output. So you need half the amount of tanks, half the amount of brews, half the amount of cleaning. You go through all of these pieces, but that drives a set of equipment. And the biggest one is really a good system to make really good, clean, sterile deaerated water. I think that is the one piece that large brewers almost all have, is that ability to make that water, because you'll need that. As we know, oxygen is not beer's friend. You obviously need that to do the dilution as you kind of go through the process. When we looked at, and I've done places too, where, we'll raise our Plato in the kettle by 2-3 degrees, just from a standard, because I want to add extra water going to the fermenter. Say that, my coils in the fermenter are only good for 15, I need 15 barrels in a 20. So maybe I'll do something high gravity so I can utilize that tank and create some flexibility with my 10 barrel brew house or 12. So, I mean, there's some other reasons you may even want to do it, but it does stretch your brew turns down on your brew house. So if you go high gravity and just add water on that post chase. So it's pieces that are good to think about. But in the end, it's really, everything's going to come down to water. If it's cellar water, deaerated. If it's brew house water, making sure you have plenty of hot liquor available to you to chase that brew out with, because of course you want sterile water after you just spent at least usually 60 minutes boiling, if not longer, to make sure everything's nice and sterile.
No, that's a standard gravity. That's the term I guess I need to make sure I use. And I'd like to hear more about those 32 Plato Warts that some of the craft guys are making. So what are some of the quality aspects, primarily from a malt and efficiency standpoint, would you have to pay attention to when you're doing that type of brewing?
So a lot of those brews, when you're hitting that 32 gravity, you're really looking for some very highly attenuated wort. So the big thing from a malt quality, and when I think about suppliers we've worked with in the past, it's, what kind of malt you're giving from a quality perspective. And I'm looking at this somewhat quantitatively from the fact of, how's the handling system on the malt house side. So, in your case, you guys have brand new systems there. Good quality malt arrives not beat up versus, you get malt that's been handled through a transload facility and you go down this list of supply chain pieces that by the time you get your malt, your kernels are broke, because lautering at 32 degrees Plato, whether or not you're using an adjunct, to help bring things up, like dextrose, honey, molasses, on the list of adjuncts folks use in craft. But trying to even get that lautering, you're still at 20, 21 degree Plato. A lot of my experience is about 24 Plato, and you're making up the last 6 with adjuncts that you can add into the kettle. Just getting that quality of malt non-broken so you can do the right things with mills is incredibly huge. Rice hulls, of course, you can use. And then the other piece that goes into there that a lot of folks don't think about is, where are your beta glucans? And, the general number is relatively tall, but in my years of working with Susan throughout the world, she knows where my number is, and it's usually quite a bit lower than the spec, because we know when we get to those real heavy products like that, how we can louder in the beta glucan content, which is one of the big ones, but there's a lot of other factors that play into that. Those are kind of huge going in there, because you're making some pretty concentrated mashes out there, which can also affect your overall conversion capability just in the mash, which is why, the 24 Plato wort, I typically would use some sort of endogenous enzyme. If we're making things that are going to be in the 18, 19 range, malt will take properly modified malt with a very good enzyme package, takes care of those just fine.
So without trying to put numbers in out there on my side, when you talk about a very modified malt, maybe some beta glucan numbers and a better enzyme packages, any suggestions on what those malt analysis might need to look like?
From a beta glucan side, usually my number is under 90, so that's really what I'm looking for. Under 90s, you tend to not notice it too much. You get at 102, and it doesn't sound like a lot, because a lot of times I've seen specs in the 130, 140 range for companies I've worked for. It's a huge difference. Really, when it comes down to modification, depending upon where you sit. So as a high gravity brewer, as barleys have drifted and gotten hotter and hotter, it's generally not an issue compared, because you're trying to hold malts back in craft, because you don't want to over convert in many cases. But seeing kind of that alpha range, obviously if you can get it up into the 60s, but it's really kind of the big pieces of it. It's beta glucans is the one piece that's pretty tough to deal with in your mash. Especially if you get a maltster to do it for you, which is really what I think all of us are after.
Well, good. At Proximity Malt, we're really focused on beta glucan, and we use some varieties that maybe are a little less hot than some of the more traditional North American two rows. So we've been trying to push those enzyme packages down a little bit. So hopefully that, and keep the beta glucans low. So hopefully it fits into that style. Greg, how would you compare those comments with the kind of experience you've had with high gravity brewing?
Yeah, I'd say there's a similar kind of attitude towards high gravity brewing in terms of what it can do for you in the brew house and in production. So a lot of times when we're talking on smaller level breweries, we're talking about high kettle original gravity. So we're talking about high concentration wort that is used for imperial beers, it's triple IPAs, it's imperial stouts, barley wines, that sort of stuff. It's fairly rare to see a smaller craft brewery add water downstream. Usually that's going to be before the heat exchanger, or it's going to be water running through the heat exchanger after to fill a kettle, a tank, if that is the case. I do know of some regional craft brewers who brew essentially like one or two styles, and it's all packaged, and they're sending hot water through the heat exchanger to kettle up to add volume, just like we were talking about. But the technology to have deaerated, sanitized, sterilized water to hit the cold side is usually out of the range of possibility for people of any sort of size, smaller size in the craft beer world. So you don't see a lot of that. But a couple interesting, I think, notes about high gravity brewing on the craft scale is there's been some really interesting innovations in trying to get that wort gravity up. So a lot of people will do a mash, a pretty high gravity mash, run over about half the kettle, start boiling that, empty that mash tun out, do another mash and run that in to fill their kettle volume, and then do long boils to concentrate. Another one that I think, and maybe it was Matt Brownson kind of popularized, I think is called the reiterative mash, I believe. And essentially you mash like a 15 Plato wort, you run that out into the kettle, and then you take and you run into the kettle the amount of strike water you need to then mash a second mash of the same amount. So you're actually taking that wort and mashing in a second round of grain letting it sit and convert, and then pulling that off and filling your kettle with that. And essentially what that does is it gets you a concentration of almost double your each mash. So you can, in theory, get up to about 30 Play-Doh in the kettle. I've done that before with some success. You have to be really careful about if you're doing like an Imperial Stout, it's very difficult because if you have any adjuncts in there, if you have a significant amount of roast, those roast pieces don't have husks. So you're gonna, really easy to get a stuck mash with a reiterative process. But that's the truth with any Imperial Stout you're trying to brew. But I think this is an interesting conversation because I think the first way we talk about this as pushing production, pushing a kettle that is, undersized for your system, or you don't want to do 2 turns in a day to fill that kettle and you're doing a light beer. This might be a really great way for people to, produce 2 turns with 1 kettle full. Your extract efficiencies might not be as great because you're leaving extract behind. But a day of labor and utilities could also be a huge benefit of savings.
Yeah, that was one of the questions I had in loudering when you're talking about the method that you just spoke about, Greg. When you're running off into the kettle, do you have to cut it off with a higher last runnings Play-Doh number? And that being said, how does it affect your brew house efficiencies then as well?
So your brew house efficiencies overall will go up quite a bit because you are extracting more out of each one of the grains because you're doing it essentially twice. But the math's a little bit weird. So you want to create a grist bill that is the equivalent of like 15 Play-Doh if your kettle was full at the end of lauter. And then but you're only filling that kettle to your strike volume for your second mash. And so you're taking that wort of that specific volume, moving it over there, mashing that, and then you're going to run off and lauter as usual to get your kettle full. So you have a higher concentration of first wort, essentially, is what you're doing. And then you're using your normal lauter function to rinse out that grain, and then you'll get to your kettle full, and you should be pretty close to double your original mash. So your actual extract efficiency goes significantly up versus trying to get a 30 Play-Doh wort out of just 1 mash and lauter, which is near impossible. I mean, you probably have to do like a 9-hour boil to make that happen, depending on the system. So.
Tim, have you had any experience in essentially using the wort as the strike water for the mash?
We haven't necessarily used it for a high gravity perspective, but I've worked at breweries where you recover last wort running. So if you get down to some of the products and maybe not like an Imperial Stout, but you get down where you're finishing up at a 7 Play-Doh, you'd run that back and that would be part of your mash foundation water. So you just very similar process where you're just kind of reusing that water. So rather than starting with 0, you're starting with the 7 Play-Doh and you just kind of continue to add to that. Those systems I have put in breweries, and it does help significantly with the efficiency, especially if you're doing 5 or 6 brews in a fermenter. So obviously mid-size craft. But the one piece you always have to keep in mind is it's easy with all malt. If you start dealing with a high level of adjunct and it is a company philosophy, you're very sticky about it's got 30% adjunct, 70% malt base for my extracts. That's where back to the point, it's like that's where you need to look at it and say, hey, based upon that, I got to do some tweaking in there. But the systems do exist. I mean, people actually use them today from a high gravity perspective on top of that. So it's very similar to having like a weak wort collection system or something else in there, minus without calling it that. But it's the thought process is very similar to that, as Greg had mentioned.
So Tim, something I've been curious about with this process, especially what you were talking about post fermentation, adding water downstream or adding water really at any point, is how does that impact pH, and how concerned does a brewer need to be about the pH of that water as it affects the wort or the fermented beer?
I mean, when you're using. So I haven't worked at any breweries yet where all of our deaerated water systems have had anything done to them other than straight UV sterilization. So it doesn't, because beer has a pretty good buffering capability by itself, and unless you've got some really, pieces in your water that we all know you can compensate for them through the brew house, or stylistically. So, you know, if you think about an adjunct lager or other beers, you could add a lot of water without truly affecting the pH too much into that process. So we don't necessarily correct for that, but you can also correct for it upstream. So if you know that I have a calcium target from a gushing perspective in my final beer, I'll make a number up of 50. Well, if I'm going to add 1 barrel of beer and 1 barrel of water in the end, I need to be at 100 when I'm in my maturation stage or I'm aging it out. So you'll actually, with some water adds, you'll do some corrections depending on what you're looking for. And as a company where you're philosophically, you look at it. And again, I've worked for one company, so I brought up calcium because that was one of our driving specs in our finished beer, just to make sure we didn't have any gushing. So we had a spec number there, so we just compensated up front. So like with anything, you know, we think about high gravity brewing, and I might be jumping on you guys, so I apologize, but you think about it, you have to think about what your end goal is, right? So if you're looking for a 20 BU beer and you're going to go 2-to-1, then you better be 40 in the brew house, unless you're going to do a post-cellar extract add, for instance. So all of those pieces, even in your chemical treatment of your water, you want to think through that. And then, but you also need to think through what the effects on the enzymatic reaction is going on in your mash, because you could overcorrect for something. So you might have to do something, again, depending upon your water quality. But I haven't worked on both. I've worked on both coasts, and I haven't really seen any breweries where that's been an issue where we've done anything other than just basically sterilize the water that we'd use for aeration.
If we were to take a beer made with the standard gravity that we talked about, or as Matt said, versus a beer utilizing a high gravity process, either before the fermenter or post fermentation, what would the differences possibly be that we would pick up if they're made to the same specs? Would we notice them? Is there a quality drawback or quality advantage to doing a high gravity brew, or are they relatively the same?
In the big picture of things, you wouldn't notice the difference. I've put beers in front of people, produced both high gravity and produced standard gravity or as is gravity, and people couldn't tell the difference. The pieces that we have to keep in mind is the yeast will perform differently. So, you know, as you make that move into a higher gravity product, if you're doing a post dilution, like again, like you mentioned, some regional craft guys do, or they do small amounts. But if you make that, you have to make adjustments to what you're doing with yeast up front. And that kind of starts now to come back to looking at, what's in my malt, what the fan levels are, because the yeast will perform differently if you do that from that side. So you might have a different ester profile that you get it. So you might need to change your oxygen regime, your pitch rates, a little bit of your cooling temperatures. So there's a little bit, things that go with a high gravity brewing that you have to adjust that aren't necessarily malt related. But you need to think about that as you kind of go through the process. But in general, once you dial your process in, you would never tell the difference between a high gravity beer and a standard gravity beer. You just won't see them.
Oh, okay, great, interesting. Do you think you mentioned pre-amine nitrogen as yeast food? So in a high gravity situation, you would in theory have a higher concentration of fan, which could be good in a high gravity situation, I guess. Would you be looking for a lower fan package in your malt for high gravity beer? Would that be beneficial, or would you be looking for a higher pre-amine nitrogen content?
So take it from the reverse side, that Matt was mentioning, is we kind of both come out of this adjunct world. And if you're using corn or rice, there is nothing in there. So you're actually usually the other side of it. So for a craft brewer that's doing 90+% malt beers, there is not an issue with fans. So it's not necessarily that you're looking for it. But when you're starting to add a lot of adjuncts to a beer, or some guys are making, people are starting to make some Mexican lager beers, and people are starting to do things that, I think in craft, my opinion is that people are starting to say that adjuncts aren't necessarily my enemy that they would have been when I started my career 15, 20 years ago. And people are starting to embrace them and realize that they're a valuable tool in making some lighter beers. That's where if you go high gravity and let's just say you're making a 10% or a 15% lager with an adjunct in it because it makes sense, you love the flavor as a brewer, that's where you have to start paying attention. When you get even higher or more extreme adjunct ratios that could be up to 50%, then you really have to watch it. So that's kind of, I mentioned the fan or the free amino nitrogen levels. That's why we're really kind of watching those, and that comes from my background of working in macro breweries for a good chunk of my career. That there's nothing in corn or rice or in any of those other products, so we really have to pay attention to it. And it could typically be an issue in craft, but if you're if you only have 15% adjuncts, most likely it's not necessarily an issue that you'll experience, but it's a potential to be aware of.
Is there any beer style that you would say, from maybe personal experience or just preference, that would not be a good candidate for a high gravity brewing process?
I'm not a fan of using IPAs in high gravity brewing, so I kind of threw it out there as jokingly, but I call it medium gravity brewing. I think there's some efficiencies you can gain by making sure that you're a little bit high, so you can push your lines out with a little bit better clean water, and if you have a dehydrated water or sterile water available to you, that you can push lines out. The reason I don't like it for IPAs is I think you get to the point with the hop loading that people are doing these days, you just start to struggle with hop efficiencies, and hops aren't cheap. I mean, none of our raw ingredients are cheap, but you just start to struggle with that hop efficiency. If you get too high, it just doesn't want to. I don't think you get great isomerization of the hops and utilization. So you just kind of keep throwing more hops at it, and you're like chasing your problem backwards. I'm going high so I can get better efficiency, but I'm leaving more behind in the whirlpool. So it's like, where do you chase that one out? So I'm not a fan of doing IPAs that way, and it's primarily more around hops than just the malt package and the wort itself. That's my personal preference with it. That I'm just not a big fan of doing super high gravity with those products.
So much the same as some of the technical aspects of like making sure we have enough fan in the finished wort, its sensory, etc. Are there some sensory aspects with higher gravity brewing or medium gravity brewing in which there might be some aspects of the raw materials, either the malt, or sometimes we think about highly roasted malts with having some quite strong flavors? Is there any risk of sensory issues there? What things to look at? If you're doubling the strength, you have double the trouble with sensory issues coming through in the final beer. Any comments on how that might be handled?
Yeah, I haven't seen a lot. I mean, if it's from your base malt, you're going to see it whether it's high or low gravity product. The bigger issues, I think, start to come down, and when you start to use these highly modified roasted malts, that's where you'll see it from a performance side. And then you'll see that because with some malt companies out there over the years, we've seen some inconsistency when you think about some of the products that they're doing on color. I mean, you look at a bag of malt and it's like, well, there's 3 different colors in here that are obvious. It's not even a question. And I think a lot of us have probably experienced something like that over time. But that's where you'll start to see it, is with those products. But I think they will hit you more when you start to back up into your lauter than they will on sensory, because as they're highly roasted, they just come through as they come through. So I haven't really seen it, but if it's your base malt, you definitely can. You just essentially in one brew made double the amount. So that's where you'll see it. But in general, once you're dialed in, it works pretty well.
That it kind of talks about the same type of concentration. The next thought I had was, and Greg knows a lot more about this than I do. He has a lot of experience in making some hazy beers, which we try to make sure they stay hazy throughout the process. And as I learned brewing early in my career, it was all about making sure that we had good physical stability for clear beer, and we didn't want haze or particulates. And in the brew kettle, it was really focused on making sure we had a good hot break, a good strong boil, so that we could get nice interaction between tannins and proteins to form flock that can then come out in a whirlpool, or in some brewing in cold wort settlers to make American lager beers. But in today's day and age of making craft hazy beers, how would making this medium gravity wort or brew house high gravity wort affect haziness?
That's a great question. I think it would be an interesting experiment to do a true high gravity where you're taking deaerated, sterilized water downstream, like maybe packaging. I would be more concerned about that affecting haze stability. I think if you're just like kettling up, which I've done a million times, especially at my first brewery, Silver City, we had a very undersized kettle. And so we would get to kettle full, boil down, and then add water to get to our gravity and expand the kettle volume and just maximize that kettle. So there's a lot of that happens. I don't think that's going to be a huge deal. I think what we found, a lot of research has been shown and a lot of just, anecdotal evidence from the brewers, is that pH is a huge driver. So throughout the boil process, so you don't want to have too high of a pH so that you are coagulating proteins that are then going to fall out. So you want to keep the pH low between 5.0 and 5.2. And when you get to higher gravity, you want to have even lower pH. I think there's a paper that just came out about that. That's really interesting. And you're also looking at, interactions between your yeast and your hops and your the proteins in the wort. So there's a lot of different actions that are happening to create and keep that haze stable. But pH seems to be the biggest driver to make sure all that happens and then stays in solution. So I think if you're doing a high gravity version, pre-fermentation, I think you'd probably be okay, just as a theory. I would think that maybe downstream you might run into issues, but I don't really know how that would affect it. Tim, you might know a little bit more about the science on that aspect of it, but it might be fine. I mean, if you have a good stable product and you're adding good quality water that's not adding oxygen, you might be fine.
Yeah, like I said, I'm not 100% sure. I think to your point, if everything is good downstream, I think it will be okay. But it would be an interesting experiment to see somebody do it, because I just don't know of anybody doing it personally.
Are there conversations that you would suggest, Greg and Tim, to brewers to have conversations with their maltsters about that? This is how they're going to be working with that malt in the brew house to make high gravity. And is there anything that the maltsters can help them to understand the dynamics and how that might go through the brew house?
Yeah, I mean, I think from my perspective, anytime that, if you're a brewer, you should always talk to the people supplying your raw ingredients about how you intend to use it. There are always tricks to the trade, per se, as you're going through there. The people are like, hey, if we're doing this, we can modify this or we can modify that. So having that conversation, whether you're high gravity brewing or doing anything, is always, in my opinion, massively important to understand, how your whole supply chain works, and to make sure that, you understand how to modify malt. I'm not a maltster. I mean, I have my own opinions, but I think when all's said and done, you need to have that conversation. When it really comes down to that high gravity piece, I think that's important for maltsters too, because as you're selecting bends or you're selecting pieces for people, if you understand what they're doing, it's nice to be on the other side where, if my preference is to have a fan level of X and a beta glucan level of Y, and those are that. Everything's in spec, but as a maltster, you can also help us, and you can help any brewer through that process. It's just kind of like, okay, here's how we can go. We can kind of move these there. We know that's the preference. There's a piece, and we all need to understand, what the supply chain looks like and how it works, and know that not every brewer can mandate everything for every maltster. There's always give and take in the supply chain, and I think that sometimes as brewers, we forget that not only with our maltsters, but we forget that with our barley growers, we forget that with our hop growers and our hop breeders. We want everything and we forget. So there's got to be a give and take. Sorry, I'm on a soapbox now, guys. There must be a give and take. So we can understand, but you don't have the conversation, you can't even get the give and the take, right? So that's a piece that's very important, that people understand what you're doing. And if you're starting to make this change in your process, you want to have the conversations ahead of time, because if you make the change after process, it's easy to say, well, it's because of X or because of B, but people always have that watch out that you really want them to have. And I think it's hugely important that people have to talk to theirs, because they really want to make sure that, you're getting what you need, because you might know based upon another customer that it's like, if you do that, here's what we saw them, here's a couple of watch outs. So I think that's hugely important that people do it. Because a lot of folks, and I think as craft brewers and as an industry, people are getting better at looking at their specs and really understanding their specs. But I've known for years, and if I roll back 5 years, I would say that most people, you hand them a set of malt specs, they just look at it and it's like, oh, great, thanks. They care about one number and it's extract. And that's the number they get and it's the number they understand. But, you know, as the industry has become more educated and people are learning more and more, I still think it's kind of, you know, that's the bit of understanding. But I'm not an expert on malt analysis by any hands myself too. I know the 5 numbers that I look at that I really like. And if they're where they are, I get my green light and I'm good. And I don't have to say anything to anybody. But I think that's the piece of, you know, use your suppliers for education. It's huge, important, whether it's high gravity brewing or just your daily business.
Yeah, I think that's really important. People are starting to look more at specs. I think as we've seen the droughts happen over in Canada and the west side of the country, we're seeing with some suppliers, we're seeing a higher protein content. We're seeing just a different COA than you might expect over the past, you know, multiple decades. So I think it's really important for all brewers always to shop your COAs. So get COAs from the suppliers you're interested in. Take a look, see what's important to you. If it's low fan numbers, if it's low beta glucans, if it's, you know, any of those specs that you find is important. And the ironic part about it is, as brewers, we always look at this extract as the end all be all. But that's the one thing as brewers we can control. If it's a lower extract, we can add 5 pounds. If it's a higher extract, we can take it away. It's the only thing about a COA that we can really actually make a difference on as brewers. It's more difficult to adjust free amino nitrogen. It's more, you know, you're going to have to add maybe enzymes with high beta glucan, which if you may or may not want to do. So shop COAs, see, you know, take the emotion out of the equation, see what was going to work best for you, especially in a high gravity situation, and talk to your malt rep and talk about how, you know, why do they grow that specific barley? Why are they using that varieties? You know, why are they using North American genome 2-row varieties, or are we using European genome 2 varieties? Like, what is the priority of the maltster, and who are they making that malt for? And then also take, you know, look at that COA and see if that really works for you.
You know, Greg mentioned, it's like, well, I need to maximize my kettle. You know, the one thing we haven't talked about, there's a safety function to going a little bit higher and topping up your kettle or pushing later. Because if I'm pushing my kettle, that's the #1 injury we see in craft beer, that people get burnt. And, you know, if you go in, you got a 10-barrel kettle, you're filling it to 9 and you're willing to push it out later, even though you're not really high, but you take that from a concept side, even though you're only after 10, there's still a way to help drive some safety in your brewery just by changing your thought process to not say I got to brew 10 and knock out 10. I might brew 9 and knock out 10 because I'm pushing it with water, but there's a safety function. Sorry, I have to say, I just can't, you know, think as we've looked at injuries in the industry, that people can do this and not even like push it too hard, but there's a way to help make the brewery safer that, you know, you should think about as you're brewing and take into consideration.
You know, just to add a little more detail to that, the way that I've seen that done very successfully is by completing the boil and then using your hot liquor, not adding it until you're almost done with the knockout. So maybe you knocked out 80% of the kettle. So in a 10-barrel system, you're down to 2 barrels left. Then you start adding your hot liquor and chase it into the fermenter or into the whirlpool, where hopefully you have that volume and it can be held at a safe manner. So that might be one technique to do that. And I think that's what Tim was talking about when he says to chase it as opposed to topping it off in the kettle.
Well, I think, Tim, you were talking about just having a lower boil volume initially, right?
Yeah.
So keeping it at 9, at a 8, boiling that, and then stopping that boil and then adding your hot is a lot safer than being all the way up to the brim and boiling. And then if that foam goes over the top, it's going to get onto somebody that's hot. So I think the idea of a kettle top off or Wart or adding downstream, yeah, I think it's a really good option for improving safety in the brew house, for sure.
And then Matt, you brought up an interesting point that we haven't really talked about, but when you talked about process of chasing, in my mind, it's not a very significant volume. But watch out that, you know, as a craft brewer, you'd want to have, so I'll just make the numbers up. If you're doing a 10-barrel kettle knockout, you cool 10 barrels, and if you chase it with 5, it's probably not going to mix well in the fermenter. So it's just something that, you know, as a craft brewer, you want to think about. I don't know that it necessarily needs to be blended going into the fermenter, but you risk potentially having stratification in the fermenter with that method, and it's very easily overcome. So you can put some of it in up front, cool into that, but it's really, you think about how you pitch an osmotic stress on the yeast. It's just something that we hadn't really talked about, but it's something to think about because it's still got to mix in the fermenter, and generally Wart's heavy, so in theory it will go to the bottom, but in theory part of that water goes to the top, and now you have this homogeneous solution going in there. In a perfect world, you'd blend your water in at a rate, but that's probably not what most people are capable of. So, one thing that for over years where I've talked to folks doing, and I always recommended, depending upon your volume, if you can get maybe 50% in the fermenter and chase with 50, but you got to look at it at a percentage. So if you're only adding 10%, probably not a big deal. If you're adding 50%, you might want to think about splitting those just to make sure that gets homogeneous. Because if you're pitching during cooling, like some folks do, your yeast is going to go in there and be subjected to very high gravity wort in a high osmotic situation, and then you're going to add it to water. And as Susan mentioned, I started as a microbiologist, so yeast does not like high osmotic changes quickly if it can help it. So it's just something to think about. Also from a process side, we haven't really talked about it, but it's something the brewers need to consider.
Yeah, that's an excellent point. I've experienced many of that stratifications as we were trying to adjust the final gravity of beers in the finished cellar. It was amazing how beer can stratify like that. So good point, Tim. Thank you for pointing that out.
Well, Tim, it's been an honor to have you come talk to us, especially with, such a wide background you have of some great breweries, and your experience and your knowledge has been really great. So thanks so much for coming on. Any parting comments for anyone who's looking to kind of explore the world of high gravity brewing?
Don't be afraid of it, and drop your dogmas if that's the reason you're not doing it, because you can do it very successfully. In the bit, sometimes you just have to think about doing things differently, but don't be afraid of it. But don't just go into it full bore without thinking about it.
Drop your dogmas. I like that.
Yeah, drop the dogmas. I'm going to use that one. I'll write that one down.
I'm going to put that on a t-shirt and wear that around.
Yeah, Tim.
I thought you said walk the dog.
Also good advice.
Take a break.
Well, great. Yes, thank you, Tim. I think Greg did a nice job saying that, but thank you very much for your time. It's been an enjoyable chat.